There is an interesting situation in the Big 12 in 2025, which I find fascinating because you don't generally see something like this happen. And I think it maybe should happen more frequently than it does. And that is there are two different head coaches going back to somewhere where they've already been. You don't get a lot of retreads. You don't get a lot of coaches coming back to where they once were for a variety of reasons. One, a lot of times coaches are leaving jobs because they got fired. Two, coaches are leaving jobs because they found a better fit, more money, a step up the ladder, and not everybody appreciates being used in that facet. But there are two unique situations where Scott Frost is going back to Central Florida and Rich Rod is back at West Virginia. And so I wonder which one of those two are going to be more successful in their second go-round. And I want to know your thoughts. Hit me in the comments below. Who do you think, whether it's Rich Rod at West Virginia or Scott Frost at Central Florida, who is going to be more successful the second time around? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And I think it's an interesting go-around again because both were wildly successful in their initial runs at these two schools. It's why they're welcomed back. If you weren't good at that stop, if Scott Frost had gone 0-13 instead of 13-0, he's probably not welcomed back with open arms at UCF. Like, please, for the love of God, come back to us. It's just generally, I feel like it's self-explanatory, but you do have to point that out that, like, these guys found the height of their careers at these locations. And so they have sentimental history with these jobs, but they also probably feel like they have unfinished business with these jobs. I would imagine that if you asked Rich Rodriguez, hey, when you left West Virginia to go to Michigan, did you make a mistake? He'd probably tell you, yeah. He'd probably tell you, like, I wished I had stayed here all that time. All the time with Michigan, all the time with Arizona, all the time with Jacksonville State. I probably should have just stayed at West Virginia. And if you ask Scott Frost, he might not tell you that he shouldn't have taken the job at Nebraska, but I imagine there's a lot of people in Lincoln who wish that Scott Frost, in retrospect, hadn't taken the job in Lincoln and that he could have built a juggernaut at UCF. But I think it's an interesting question of who is going to be more successful. And I think part of it is resume, right? If you look at Scott Frost and what he has done in his time at Central Florida, he went 6-7 in his first year. And I feel like it's important to remember and think about because we don't always remember that college football always hasn't been the way it is or has been most recently with NIL, transfer portal, etc. 2017 is a different world altogether than where we're at right now. And Scott Frost took a team from 6-7 to 13-0. And there was not a chance for Scott Frost to take Central Florida to the college football playoff. You could argue that that did exist. It really didn't. There wasn't a pathway for the Knights to make the college football playoff, a four-team college football playoff at that time. So topping out at 13-0 and winning a conference championship and beating a Power 4 school in a bowl game, that is the height that UCF could have reached at that time. Now, I mentioned that both of these two schools in the Big 12 are having retread coaches. And another interesting nugget is that neither one of those coaches were at those schools when they are now in the Big 12. And whether that plays a factor or not is probably part of the discussion as well. Because while Scott Frost can recruit the hell out of Florida and recruit the hell probably out of a lot of places, should he want to, and there are a lot of rumors about Scott Frost and maybe some lack of maturity or alcohol abuse at Nebraska and things like that, I think you're going to see that play out one way or another at UCF. Either he flames out and is a disaster and all of those people in Lincoln look like they were proved right, or the Husker fans have to question, why did our prodigal son who returned home, why was he so wildly unsuccessful if he does find success again at UCF? But you look at that career win percentage at UCF, he goes 73% of the time he's winning. That's a nice base to work with. If a lot of schools would take, yes, if we win 73% of our games, I feel pretty good about what that looks like. Now, the downside of that is that Scott Frost went 16-31 in his seasons at Nebraska. And by God, they were some of the best 3-9 teams the sport has ever seen. But that doesn't mean a whole lot now, does it? So he's got a 73.1% win percentage at the place where he is going back to. Rich Rodriguez really had West Virginia humming. Now, he had a little bit bigger sample size, which is both a chance to stack more wins and also lose more games. But Rich Rodriguez at West Virginia went 60-26, which feels, the losses feel a little bit high, and a lot of them came early in his tenure when he was still kind of riding that ship, because they had some 10-9 win seasons in the back half of his tenure at West Virginia. But when you look at it, Scott Frost had a higher win percentage in his time at Central Florida than Rich Rod did at West Virginia. 60-26 all time, 69.8% win percentage for Rich Rod. So one reasonable person could argue, hey, Scott Frost had more success in his time at UCF than Rich Rod did at West Virginia. I think that's one of those situations where you can use numbers to say whatever you want, because I think if you were to ask if you were a Family Feud style it and ask 100 people on the street who was more successful, Rich Rod at West Virginia or Scott Frost at Central Florida, I think you're going to get probably like 85% of them would say Rich Rod at West Virginia. This was like West Virginia was Pat McAfee making a field goal with several opportunities away from going to the national championship game. He had West Virginia as, if not the most interesting teams in the sport, one of the most interesting teams in the sport, which they have not been at or close to really since. And so I think there is a bit of one nostalgia for Rich Rod at West Virginia, maybe more so than the nostalgia that comes with Scott Frost returning to UCF. But then when you look at what they've done outside of where they've been, I feel like that's kind of what you have to go on, right? Scott Frost is 16-31 at Nebraska. Rich Rodriguez, everywhere other than West Virginia, is 130, 103, and 2. And that includes some abysmal seasons as the head coach in Michigan. And there are a lot of ways to talk about that. I think you just kind of punt it, because that tenure in Michigan football history, Brady Hoke has been really successful in his college coaching career outside of when he was the head coach at Michigan. Rich Rodriguez has been really successful as a college head coach outside of when he was the head coach at Michigan. Jim Harbaugh has been really successful everywhere he's been outside of before Michigan started illegally scouting their opponents. But that's neither here nor there. Rich Rod 130, 103, and 2 outside of West Virginia. And part of that, his win percentage is at 70% at West Virginia, where Scott Frost was outside of Nebraska, or outside of UCF, I beg your pardon, at Nebraska, 16-31. And there are different things that go into that, where there's probably a lot more pressure on Scott Frost at Nebraska than maybe there was of Rich Rodriguez at Arizona, at Michigan, at Jacksonville State. And so I don't know if it's necessarily apples to apples, but I feel like that's the best thing to go off of, is you both were successful at this stop once before. You both were successful. One of you has been really successful away from that. There are a lot more advantages, in my opinion, at UCF than there are at West Virginia. The recruiting base, out of this world. Facilities are, West Virginia's getting better, but they're on this kind of island along with UCF, in that the places that they recruit from, you're not going to play a whole lot like UCF gets to recruit from Florida, and they get to play 6, 7, 8 games a year in Florida. West Virginia recruits kids from Florida, and they get to play 2, if they're lucky, games a year in Florida. So there are extenuating circumstances, but I just feel like each has had that one coaching tenure that you could just punt, that you can just go, wait a second. And there are a lot of coaches that have that on their resume when you sit down and think about it. Like Lane Kiffin, I think, is a really smart, interesting college football coach, and he's got a tenure on his resume that at USC that you would just go, that didn't happen. Bill Belichick is one of the greatest NFL coaches of all time, and he's got a coaching tenure on his record that you would go, maybe the Cleveland Browns. So there are extenuating circumstances. I think UCF might be more set up to be successful, but I would pick Rich Rodriguez in this situation. I would say that Rich Rod is more set up and better set up to be more successful in go-around number 2. And if he isn't successful at West Virginia, I think that leads to a lot of questions about what the Mountaineers are, where the Mountaineers should be, and what their college football future looks like. Because they should be either, in my opinion, the kind of the bottom of the B tier or the absolute top of the C tier in the sport. And they have not been there recently. I thought Neil Brown was going to kill it at West Virginia, and it just never really worked there. So Rich Rod being back, I think, is sort of like opening day in baseball, where everybody is filled with hope, right? Everybody feels as if this is the year, this is the guy that's going to bring us back to the promised land. And I think they should feel like that a little bit. But whether he's going to bring West Virginia to the heights that he did in his first go-around, I don't know. But if he falls flat on his face, I think there's lots of questions. And I don't think there are as many questions if that happens at UCF if Scott Frost fails. Again, want to know your thoughts. Which one of these two who are going back to their old stomping grounds are going to be more successful and go around number 2? Let me know in the comments down below. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you are watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out. If you're listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode of the Daily Huddle.